Okay. Hey, everybody, welcome. It's so nice to have you. I appreciate you all coming. This is the first Motivation Monday of the season. My name's Samantha Mackey, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa. My supervisor is Dr. John Renalucci, and my research focuses primarily on identity, STEM, and motivation. My thesis work centers on the ways in which identity impacts Indigenous women to pursue STEM-related fields. And I do this through the dynamic systems model of role identity. So Motivation Monday is hosted by the Graduate Student Committee of ARA's Motivation Education SIG. We offer this programming as a way to disseminate and share ideas and strategies for conducting educational research. This year, we are continuing our Motivation Monday format from last year by hosting a panel of scholars, practitioners in our field to discuss important topics. Our wonderful graduate student leaders have organized a series of live panels and discussions each month, so make sure to keep coming back. Today, we have four amazing scholars here to discuss running a research lab. So to start us off, we have Andre Simeon, who has earned a PhD in psychology from Stanford University in 2008 and is now a professor of psychology at New York University. His research investigates how beliefs about intellectual ability shape academic and career trajectories, with a particular focus on understanding gender and racial disparities in STEM and other fields. Andre's research has been published in top journals such as Science, PNAS, and Psychological Science, earning him the 2018 American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for early career contribution to psychology. Media outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Economist have covered his work. So thank you for joining us today. Our
My
next
pleasure.
panelist
Thanks for
is
the invitation.
Thank you. Our next panelist, Diane Cross-Francis, will be joining us around 7:30. But we'll start without them. They are the Joseph R. Uterich Team Professor in the Culture, Curriculum, and Teacher Education Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on identifying the contextual, cultural, and teacher-specific factors that influence teacher actions as they plan and instruct. By deepening our understanding of these factors, we can determine the optimal design features of professional development that allows teachers to thrive. The results of this work have informed the design and implementation of professional development initiatives in the US, Indiana, and Georgia, and internationally. Our next panelist is Nikki Lipakowski. They are an assistant professor in the learning sciences and director of the Collaborative Regulation for Emotions and Adaptive Technologies of Education Lab at McGill University. Her research focuses on designing and studying context-sensitive interventions for collaborative settings that incorporate cutting-edge technologies and analytic methods using a social regulation of learning framework. Her lab activities emphasize mentorship, knowledge creation, and practical impact, guided by three priorities: mental health and wellness, communication, and community building. And our final panelist is Daeon Zhang. They are a PhD candidate in educational psychology and a graduate research assistant at the Brain and Motivation Research Institute at Korea University. She earned her master's degree in educational psychology from Korea University in 2023 and is currently serving as a student representative at the BMRI. Her research interests include learners' achievement goals, growth mindset, self-efficacy, task values, and academic and social emotions that motivate learners. Her research particularly focuses on interactions among motivational constructs, the influence of context and culture on achievement motivation, and evidence-based interventions to enhance student motivation. So thank you all for joining us. Our discussion today will follow two sections. So discussion with our panelists first, and then followed by a chance to have your questions answered. So please feel free to drop any of them in the chat or ask them out loud whenever we get to this section of the panel. And from there, we're going to start questions, if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so our first question for the panelists is, what does a good lab mean to you? And how do you try to build or sustain that in your own lab? Whoever wants to go first can, you can jump in.
well, I don't have too much to say on this, but as I was thinking a little bit about it, I was thinking that probably what a good lab means to me is having working with a bunch of young people who are learning things, who are excited about learning things, and who are overall happy to be there and in their lives. Um, I can only control part of that, but in terms of how to build and sustain that, I try to kind of, well, figure out what they're interested in, guide them toward projects that they find fulfilling and kind of like in the zone of proximal development, and make sure that I treat them as whole people as opposed to just researchers, right? Because that's important. And now that I'm saying all this, I realize that Natalie Hutchins, who was actually in my lab, uh, can can verify or contradict anything I say. So I'm going to have to be extra honest tonight.
I was gonna say I'm gonna come out here with a fact checking tool.
I know, right? Like, so I'm going to be looking out for the thumbs up or thumbs down from Natalie in the chat. So
Like the
anyway, so
peanut
that
gallery
was
had hoped to see.
that's right. So that was my simple, maybe overly simplistic answer to get us started.
I'll add on. I think to me, a good lab is about building community, and I think we all know this to be true, and I think it was heightened even more so during the pandemic about just how isolating this can be, especially those people who move across the world, across the country, et cetera, to pursue this dream, and they're just kind of all of a sudden like alone. So to me, it's creating a space where they can thrive, and I guess that's kind of like what Andre said is like they're not just machines to produce output and publications. They're humans, um, and to build that community, I think is so important. And one of the things that I really push to do is to prioritize that in my lab meetings, where we're not just talking about research and the next thing, but we really kind of build community and get to know each other and build those relationships and focus on improving ourselves as humans and researchers and those kind of things. And it's not all about business always, but again, trying to create that community, because I know PhDs are hard enough, you know, alone, but trying to kind of have that support system is something that, to me, that's what a good lab is.
Hi, I'm Diane, and I'm actually just a PhD student and a student representative at our lab. And from this student point of view, I think our lab is good enough for me. And what makes our lab good um, includes like the growth-oriented and mastery-oriented culture that encourage us to learn more instead of like competing against each other. So I think that leads to like emotional bonding between the lab members and supporting each other along the way. So I think that's one of the things that makes a good lab, especially for the students.
Thank you all for sharing that. I think it's interesting, like from a student perspective, because it feels like what makes a good lab or what makes you a good lab member is your ability to pump out research. And that's all that matters is how much research can you pump out. So it's nice to hear that the focus is community and making sure that you create like a space for people to be able to do research as a unit in a non-isolating space. So I think that that was really nice because I know when I was asked that question, I think it was like I think it means you do a good job of research. So it's nice to hear what a good lab is.
Well, and I mean, I'll argue, like, kind of going back to what we all said, is like,
Mhm.
I don't think good research can be done without that, right? Like, or you will reach a breaking point. And so, again, it's that mental health, focusing on that, and like, in all the things that we do. And again, that's, well, I'm gonna get ahead of myself, but It's easier said than done, but I would argue that one can't come without the other, at least not sustainably.
We'll also say
Yeah,
you have a bit of a selection bias issue here. Like you invited people that you know have labs with people that are happy in them, I think. So,
yeah.
like this may not be a widely shared definition. But, like if you like it, then you can try to implement it in your own labs.
Right. I mean, we can give examples of what not to do. I think that's the other thing too, is just being in a variety of labs through postdocs and undergrads and like, or not undergrads, but just all the different things of, I've got some what not to do's as well if we need to go down that route.
That would actually be great to hear. And I think that will come up throughout the other questions and maybe ties into a little of our second question of like, what constitutes a lab? Is it the physical space? Is it the group of people? Is it if it's funded or something else entirely?
I'll add on real quick because something I don't want to take for granted in saying like building a community is like, I'm still an early career professor. I'm in my, I don't know, I started in January, 3.5, fourth year. And it wasn't always, to build a community means that you have to have like a funding structure in order to have multiple students and things like that. So I don't want to take that for granted and say like, oh, it's an easy thing to do. And as someone who didn't have physical space really, and now I do have, I think there's some of these things that are kind of outside of your control. So I think just kind of keeping that in mind, that this is something that you can strive towards, and you might, again, it'll take several years to be able to do. I just want to put that out there. If not like, oh, if you don't have a community within your first year. But for me, going back, like a physical space is nice, but usually you don't get to choose what that space is. So it can be a hole in a basement, or, it can be what you create of it. And again, whether it's virtual or in person, but to me, it's more about the community of people.
And the community will change. I think when you start off, it'll be you and any part-time staff member you have money to hire and your undergrads or whatever, right? So, but I think no matter how big or small the group is, you can kind of do some of the things that Nikki was suggesting to kind of foster community. And it'll look different what you have to do. Like if there's just three of you, which is going to be how it is when you start, you can go around and talk at length about you and your goals for the semester or whatever. In other cases, maybe they'll just have to be like icebreaker games or something. So what shape the community building will differ depending on your career stage and the size of your lab. But keeping that goal in mind, I think is very good. On what counts as a lab, that's actually, I thought I knew what a lab was, but then I kind of started collaborating with people in other parts of the world, and it turns out it's very confusing. So this is a more technical answer that probably you were bargaining for, but in the US, a lab is a professor's research group. So it's not the physical space. It's not, like technically, it's like whoever works with Professor so and so is a lab. In other parts of the world, labs are more like departments. For example, in Europe and France, the system that I'm familiar with, a lab is more like a department where there's like faculty lines in the lab, and a lab means that there's all these PIs there with their, like respective research groups and so on. So if we had been having this discussion somewhere in the European Union, the answer might be quite different. So labs there are actually formal administrative units. They have administrative reality. They're recognized by the university as things. In the US, it's essentially like people who work with Andre or people who work with Nikki. So you can, that has pluses or minuses, right? That means that we don't get staff members for free. But it does mean that you can make it what you will, right? And yeah, so if that's a lab, people who work with you, then you have the freedom to do whatever you want.
Also, in our case, it's the lab is organized on the base of our graduate program. Um, and in our case, we call our lab a Brain and Motivation Research Institute. So that's what counts as our lab. And we also share the office spaces, and we take the same courses, and we also it also functions as a funding structure as well, because we also apply for the grants as a team and are supported by the same grant, the same sources. And we share the same professors, like the same supervisors. So just as how Andre um, explained, it's similar in Korea how lab is defined and functioning.
I think it's interesting to highlight too that what I didn't consider is the importance of context. So, what constitutes as a lab in Canada, in Ontario, versus where McGill is versus where Andre is? Like, that's really what depends what constitutes a lab, context and where you're having it.
Well, and I had this conversation with one of my colleagues, is that some schools will make sure to hire professors that are very different. So you just end up with a department where it's like everyone kind of is in their own, because they don't want people who study the same thing. They want diversity. And other universities, they might want people who kind of all study the same thing. So the lab, the opportunity to build that lab, it's much more of that kind of a community, because everyone's kind of researching similar things, and there's that chance to build. So I guess there are the internal structures that may or may not go against. So again, I think the biggest thing of forming a lab is knowing what you can control and what you can't. There's that old proverb, but that, trying to be flexible and try to make things work, whenever you can.
To focus on maybe the things that we can control in our labs, what are some small but meaningful practices or habits that have helped create a positive lab culture?
Okay, I'll start with something. I'm very much on board with what Nikki said about making sure that everyone sees their being in the lab as kind of like we're all in this together, as opposed to we're competing with each other. You publish a paper that makes me look worse and so on. So I think whatever you can do to foster that is great. You can kind of like celebrate when papers get accepted in lab meeting, and kind of like make it seem like a lab victory, kind of like this is a good thing for all of us. You can encourage people in the lab to collaborate with one another, especially if they're thinking about some similar topics and so on, to actually build a collaboration into the structure of the projects. Yeah, I'll definitely not make comparative comments about the value of so and so's versus this other person's research or whatever, even outside the lab, but especially not within the lab. While at the same time, kind of making sure that, well, different people have different skills, in part because they're at different levels of seniority, right? So actually sending more junior people to more senior people to kind of like ask for help with various things also builds community in a way. And so far as, the more senior people, as long as they're not getting overwhelmed, feel helpful in terms of helping younger people kind of like learn the ropes. Younger people have an opportunity to bond with, more senior people, and perhaps there's collaborations that come out of that, so on and so forth. So there's lots of little things you can do, but like I guess try to think for me, try to think from the top level of like, what do I say and what do I do that will make it seem like, which is not just make it seem like, but actually create the reality of this is a collaborative space as opposed to a competitive space.
Yeah, and I'll say not just the successes, but the failures as well. And broadly deferred. I hate that word, but I remember reading a book that had like a failure party where everybody, every time they got a rejection or something like that, they put it on a list. And when the lab got to a certain number, then they would have like a rejection party. I've adapted that. That's why, sorry, I had to get up and got my little like punch card for my lab. That's like, and then in the back you write all your rejections. I've already filled up several of these. But it's like every time I get rejection or something bad, because every time you get something good, we share it and celebrate. It goes on your CV and those kind of things. But here it's like you punch, you mark it off and then you write it on the back so you can keep track of it and then headed towards some goal. So this one's the last one was my husband had to make me lasagna. Again, there's, but just this idea of normalizing it and then kind of rewarding yourself, because it means you're being productive, and it's kind of reframing how we're defining productivity, because with all the goods will be plenty more bads and things like that. So but again, it's a way of kind of celebrating, because and it is hard when you have lots of students where especially some will get fellowships and all these kind of things and then others don't, and and it's a really difficult tightrope sometimes to walk, to kind of celebrate others, knowing that others will be hurting and those kind of things. So that's why, like we said, kind of creating that space where we can all celebrate each other in the good, the bad, the in between. But it is one of the hardest things, is balancing, is when you do that community, is sometimes like that the individual piece can be a little tricky at times.
The failure cards sounds awesome. I think it's quite similar to us, that it's important for us to like experience the successes and failures together along the way, and celebrate things that are good and also bad. And I think for our lab members, I think it may sound counterintuitive, but we collaborate and we go through like tough coursework and tight deadlines together, and we also experience fun in between the tough duties to do. So I think the small fun experiences that we experience in the offices every day, we joke around. That's kind of the little habits or culture that we have in our lab that creates positive lab culture as it accumulates. Um, and because we prioritize collaboration over competition, I think that's what makes it more possible for us to like celebrate small things together and um, talk about sad things, rejections, um, in the lab offices every day.
So I think with respect to failure, I think it's absolutely a good idea to talk about failure, but it's not. I don't think it's just about celebrating it. So we're motivation scientists here, so we have to kind of like think about exactly like what perspective we're providing to students on failure, right? So I think it's very important to convey that this is a career in which there is a lot of failure and negative feedback that you will experience, and that it's kind of like there's no one ever that's never gotten rejected from a whole bunch of things, right? So I think that's just something that, from the beginning, you can tell your future students to kind of like normalize failure. That's absolutely true. The other thing is that failure is almost always a learning opportunity, right? So it's completely normal. So that's kind of like one causal perspective on failure, insofar as you can't go through and have a successful career not without failure. Probably means you're not reaching high enough. And then even the most sort of vitriolic, even the most negative, even the most careless review actually probably contains some useful lesson for you. Maybe you need to make even more obvious what the main point of your paper is, or that you did collect that manipulation check or whatever that the reviewer completely missed, right? So I think in addition to not hiding failure, I think it's important for us to think about how exactly to talk about failure so that students can learn to cope with it and turn it into kind of like a positive experience, and not necessarily a positive experience that's kind of like too vague, because it's nobody like is excited about failing, right? But kind of like turn into a productive, constructive experience.
I think it's what we do in our office is that we try to reappraise the failures and um, make make us believe in the failure is enhancing mindset, just as Andre said. And I think that's what's really important.
I think for a lot of students, this idea of failure feels very like shameful and like embarrassing that you're letting like your lab down whenever you get a paper rejected that you all worked on or things like that. So I think it's honestly nice. I know it's nice for me to hear some of the ways that like just little things that we're doing to create a more positive space in our lab, but positive space around failure, which I think is interesting. I didn't consider that when we were talking about this question.
I'll add too that transparency. I probably am a bit of an overshare, but for me, it's like I have my card too. Like I have it's that it normalizing to Andre's point of like normalizing that this is part of, and some of them and a lot of my students have conversation of like what they want to do, after with their degree, and some of them want to stay in academia and some of them don't. And I think this is part of those kind of ongoing conversations that we have about what's normal in each field. But for me, I think this stems from I had an amazing PhD. I had several advisors, but I had one that was just really great, and he talked about this. This is going to show how old we both are. The printed off version that you had to send in, and how it's just still sitting in the bottom of his desk. He's like, no one would take it. It was one of his favorite pieces. But like, just sometimes the things that you love just don't get published. It's just not you can't find the right home for it, right? It's just that kind of reframing exactly of like, it's not you, it's just kind of the way that it's fit, right? And how, it happens. We have to put our best version forward, but I also study motivations more so than emotions. So that control and value and things like that are going to creep up here and there. But again, it's that reframing and that transparency of like, this isn't happening just them. They might be the only person talking about it, but but creating that space again to where it's safe to share those so that we can, because it does happen to all of us. And if it doesn't, tell me your secrets.
I appreciate you sharing that. I guess this next question kind of ties into that of asking what were some of the biggest challenges when you first started running a lab and how do you navigate them?
No, Nikki, you.
This is something that I still struggle with is the volunteers, like just not having money. Like when you're first starting, you just don't have a lot of money. And everyone's different as far as, psychology and education. I mean, every field is different as far as like startup and university and those kind of things. But I really struggle with the financial piece because, and the specifically the students who want to be involved and I don't have money to pay them. So, the volunteer piece is something that I really struggled with, is kind of getting students involved, as Andre said, of like, when you're first building it, there's like, kind of, was it the land of misfit toys kind of thing? Mine still kind of is. Don't tell them I said that. But, that to me is something I still really struggle with, is creating a lab, like is being able to fund the people to do what I think, they should be getting paid. And that's one of the trickiest things. For me, money, it sucks. And that's not going to change, unfortunately, but at least in education.
At least you're in Canada, Nikki.
Well, yes and no. Yes, we can talk about this, but
Okay. Okay, we'll have to talk about it later. I think one of the things that you guys don't realize is that, like you're not going to get too much training in terms of running a lab in your PhD. There's so many things to learn. You're learning how to do research, which takes probably more than 5 years. You're learning on how to do research. It's going to continue beyond that. Um, but there's very little training on how to essentially be a manager, because as a PI, as the head of your own lab, you're going to have to be a manager. And that is a very hard job in and of itself. At corporations, there are people who are paid and trained to do that. Um, and you're not, and you don't know how to do it. So essentially, one of the biggest challenges for you, I think, because it was for me, and I imagine for a lot of people who aren't specifically trained to do this, is how do you motivate people to do the things that need to be done to keep the lab running. And pay is one of them, of course, but even people who are paid don't always do what they're supposed to do, right? And all of this is something that I think there's nowadays more and more kind of like training classes, I would hope, at some universities on how to manage a group. But if not, try to do as much as you can while you're still in graduate school to kind of like learn how to do that. So, for example, if your PI allows you to build your own team of research assistants, right? That might allow you to kind of have a sense of what it's around to mini lab of your own. How to select research assistants, how to, like train them, how to monitor that they're, having a good time and doing what they're supposed to be doing, how to provide feedback. All of these things are not things that, maybe for us who study motivation, some of these things we can learn from our research, but in general, there's lots of things that you're not going to learn from research. So I would say at a kind of like a 10,000-foot view, that's the biggest challenge of starting a lab. Yeah.
I'll second that. And to me, I knew that funding and expense reports existed, right? I knew, like, it's one of those, I knew about all these pieces and I knew how many emails professors supposedly get. But to me, it was just like everything at once and balancing that and still figuring out new norms. So what my comps look like is different than what my university does. So it's that balancing and not knowing what I feel like anything. I'm still learning things. That is probably the hardest thing, is to one of the big recommendations I have is to give yourself time to get acclimated before, and just don't just necessarily dive right into like building a lab and having students and these kind of things. But I will second that that you are a manager. It's one of the many hats that you'll put on.
Hi, Dr. Cross-Francis. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to welcome Dr. Cross-Francis with us. Thank you for joining.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I had a class.
That's okay. We were just discussing what are some of the biggest challenges that you had when you first started running your lab, and how did you navigate them?
I caught the tail end of the two earlier individuals, and I would say one of the biggest things, and I would definitely encourage anyone who's going to be going on the job market, it seems really attractive to negotiate getting course releases in your first year. It just seems intuitive to do that. Don't do that. Just go ahead and teach, because at that point you get the opportunity to just work on you. You teach and then you get your papers out. And if you've done a 3-article dissertation, you're already like 75 to 80% of the way gone to getting those papers out. And then you can just focus on like being neurotic about teaching, because it's going to be nuts, even if you have kind of taught before as a TA, or been a part of a class as a TA, or you taught, maybe you were an instructor of record. You were likely only doing one class like that. And then you might have up to 3 or 4 in that first year, and maybe multiple preps. And I didn't do that. I actually got a course release and it was wasted in that first year. And then in the second year, I had at least smartly negotiated one course release one year and then one the next year. I was better able to use it because I did it in the spring of the second year. And by then, I still didn't know what I was doing, but at least I kind of felt a little bit better. You know, I knew how to get to my office. I knew where the parking lot was. I kind of knew how to teach these classes. And then I actually could figure out what I would do with grad students in a lab. But that first year, I had a grad student and it was just like we were both kind of trying to find our own way. So I would say, unless you feel really confident, like you've gotten extraordinary experience as a graduate student, and all of that, I would say it seems counterintuitive, but push back on the course releases to when you can really utilize them effectively. Um, that would that would be my 2 cents. I think another thing that has been a struggle is the way that we admitted graduate students at my prior institution would be that they would just come in as a mini cohort. And so they had disparate interests, right? And I was focused on kind of looking at ed psych constructs in teacher education. And they all didn't kind of do that. So I had students who were assigned to me who we weren't aligned in terms of research interests. And so that was kind of a stretch because I didn't want anyone to be doing research that was not something that they were passionate about, but oftentimes it was a little bit tangential to what I wanted to focus on. And so it stretched me in ways that to be a good mentor, you kind of have to be stretched, but that sometimes it's just a little bit too much stretching. And it takes you too far out of your area of expertise and creates work that you didn't really require. So also if you have decision-making power about how to have people work in your lab or how you admit students or how you take on students, I would say definitely work with the ones who are more closely aligned with your interests. And I'll stop there for now.
I'm not running my lab at the moment, but like listening to how the like lab leaders struggle with things kind of scares me and is also fun to hear about at the same time. But like in terms of being a director or like the team leader among the lab members, I think it's really difficult to distribute works between the students and lab members and also the professors. We actually do have some manuals to do diverse administrative stuffs, but like in terms of research and like we're currently running an intervention study at elementary schools. So we had a lot of things that I've never experienced in the lab. Like I had to do some meetings with the principals at the elementary schools and so on. And it was quite difficult for me to like distribute work to the like most appropriate degree. I wanted to, I didn't want to put too much burden on the other students, but also help them learn at the same time. So I think that would be a big struggle for me as I proceed with my career.
Yeah, delegation is a huge thing of being a manager, as we were talking about before. So, what do you do yourself and what do you delegate? And you come from grad school where you did everything yourself. I tested like 80% of the kids that I ran in grad school myself. And all of a sudden, I had all these other people running studies who weren't me, right? And I did all my stats, and now I have to work with students who are going to do the stats. So, like how do you manage that changing dynamic is going to be something that you need to be prepared for. Like at some point, you're going to have to be comfortable letting other people do their jobs. But then you also need to figure out how you want to have sort of quality checks along the way or pit stops along the way. You can kind of like make sure that even if you didn't do this yourself to your, own exact satisfaction, that ultimately the product is something that you're happy to put out in the world.
I'll add that I did like 3.5 years at two different postdocs, and that really helped. And they were research focused. And I had, a variety of mentors at those different things. And again, got a lot of experience. So some of that I was already kind of running. I was that person that got delegated some stuff. So I kind of transitioned into that. But one of the things I always recommend, and something I really prioritize, but it's easier said than done, is that kind of like hidden curriculum and these kind of things. So coming to these, so I encourage my students, even though none of them are here, to go to these sessions and to kind of learn about these things. But I really suggest for students who are interested in going to academia and is to ask your supervisor, for advice on these things. This isn't something, again, tailoring it to different students. I think it's important that you understand like what they want to pursue, kind of their future goals and those kind of things, and kind of give them some advice and help them. There's certain tasks that I'll do that I know I can't delegate to them, but I can like involve them in it, and so that they can kind of see and then maybe eventually delegate to them. A lot of mine are mentoring undergrads right now, to have like an official kind of mentoring experience. But I think that's the other key, is really encouraging them, and I'm encouraging you to kind of, if there's something that you want to ask for it. I know that's something I did at my my second postdoc, is sit down with my supervisor and kind of like ask questions about this of, how did she do this and how did she do like all those kind of things. But sometimes you don't know what to ask. That's a whole nother thing. But I think if there is something that you're curious about and things like that you want to get involved, because that's some like exactly what Andre said of like delegating. Sometimes I don't know who to do it, and so if they come to me, that helps a lot to know who to kind of give that to.
I think when we were writing this question, I didn't consider the management piece as being a challenge. I didn't even consider that because I didn't realize that you'd be managing, yes, your new grads and your groups and your team, but also yourself and your career. As Dr. Cross Francis said, I didn't even consider the fact that you have to advocate for yourself and your career and what you're able to take on while also supporting your lab and your students and being what they need.
And I'll say I've done all of this like individually, right? So I used to be a high school teacher, so I've done the teaching. I am an adult, kind of, I know about managing bank accounts and things like that. I've mentored here and there, but then now all of a sudden it's like everything all at once. And that's something I definitely didn't do at first. And I'm still terrible about, is that kind of like setting those boundaries and making a space and kind of figuring out how they all run together. Because I think I've been kind of treating them, compartmentalizing, when really there's some overlap there that can, make that run a bit more smoothly.
I think one of the things too that has been, I would say, has been my most difficult challenge is, and challenge not in the sense that I don't recognize that, or it was a struggle. I didn't come to learn it. I knew it, but it is navigating the different personalities of the people in my lab and kind of how it is that they need to be mentored. And I think outside of one person, if you have two, like none of them are going to be the same. And I really want to be able to, for everyone to have an effective or successful experience while not draining me. And I can move my stuff forward. And it's different in terms of, so you talk about delegating. And I was just like, you got your butt to grad school, you can do this. Not always. Sometimes you might need to have a conversation and walk through some things. And then you also might have to let go of, I wouldn't say that I'm not a nitpicky person. I'm not a perfectionist by any way, but I just kind of like things to be done the way I want it to be done. And realize that, well, maybe they have a better way to do it. Maybe if you just provide some guidance and then say, go forth and produce, they might come back with a product that's better than what you did before. And so some of that letting go and allowing for some autonomy, um, knowing who and when they're ready for that. So knowing who needs that and when they need it is sometimes difficult to determine. Um, Knowing that you want the least frustration for you and that person. And so spending time, I think, from the time they indicate that they want to be a student of mine, I already start to try to navigate, to try to get a sense of who they are from the first time they send an email, from the way that they follow up, from the way that they take up what I say in terms of advice, the what they write in their application. I'm already trying to profile, so that when they show up, I'm somewhat prepared for who I expected, and that I can support them in the best way that I can, recognizing that they're all individuals and there is a common element. Oftentimes they're really sharp. That's why they're going to grad school. But that brilliance shows up in different ways. And a part of being a mentor is being able to identify that as early as possible and then create a pathway for them that's going to be effective for them and not frustrating for you.
To build on this idea of mentorship and management, how do you mentor and support lab members at different stages? So whether that's like a first year to a fourth year, undergrads to PhD students, how do you do that?
I can start here. Everybody has responsibility for supporting everybody else. And so that is a culture that I build. Once you enter the lab, you realize that everybody supports everybody else. So there are things that I don't need to show anybody how to make a table, how to make a chart, how to code. I don't ever need to do that again. Because I have third and fourth year students who can, okay, work with such and such, and then, work through the coding. Depending on when they do a qualitative class, or their inquiry classes, they come up with certain skills, but it's never enough. And so knowing who to pair them with to help them to kind of develop those skills. And then once they've kind of gotten off the ground, and then I do kind of partner them with me to make sure they're kind of where they're supposed to be. So there are a whole set of things that I don't need to work with people from scratch anymore because I have someone else that can do that. And I see that as a part of their own development, that they will soon have grad students and they will soon have people that they're mentoring. And this is a part of the process, but I'm explicit about it. So before I say, okay, Elise, you're going to work with Natalie, I'm going to have a conversation with Natalie and say, okay, I'm going to pair Elise with you to work on this. What are some of the things that I want that you think are going to be really important for you to do as you're working with this person? Don't tell them everything, listen to them, kind of navigate those kinds of things. So it's not just, fly by the seat of your pants, do whatever. And that's a way that I'm saying, like, when you have your grad students, like, this is what you are going to do. You want to sit with them, you want to walk with them through these certain things, and so on and so forth. And we do a lot of work in schools as well. All of the students that I work with have experience in schools, and sometimes it's flipped. They've been in schools more so closer than I have been. So sometimes then it works the other way. We're going to go out into the schools. What are some of the things that are like big deals in schools? Like what's the best way to enter into working with teachers? So I think that's also a really good way of also showing that you're a learner, that there are things that they also have expertise in areas that you can grow in. And I think that builds for a pretty supportive culture.
I think for me, I try to make sure that by the time they come out of grad school, they're not clones of me because I think it's hard to place students if they're too similar to their advisors. They need to have their own kind of like unique identity. But that's not necessarily something that they're prepared to start engaging with, those questions about who am I and what will I be doing with my research life from the beginning. So I think I see kind of like roughly two stages to their being in grad school. One is when you're learning the ropes, and there's like some low-level mechanical skills, like Dion was saying. But also even beyond that, there's just like learning how to think about research design and things which some other people in the lab can help, but also lots of one-on-one conversations about like, well, why would this work and why would this not work? You know, like, do these stimuli make sense or do they not make sense? What exactly is the research question again? And does this address the research question or not? So, you know, like that sort of like that takes time to fall into place. But you know, starting in second, third, most of that, if things go according to plan, is in place. So then we can start thinking more purposely. I ask questions like, so if you were to write your research statement, like what would you say? You know, like if somebody's thinking about a new study, like how does this fit into the narrative of how you see yourself in the field, right? So that you gotta get them thinking about, you know, how they will, I mean, for lack of a better word, market themselves for when they're on the job market. And I realize not everyone wants a research job or you know, like at a research institution and so on, but you know, I also try to signal very clearly that I'm just going to start with that assumption. And then if you change your mind, then we can just figure something else out and it's not a problem. But anyway, so kind of like that's kind of my arc, you know, like let's get you up to speed with how to do research and then let's figure out who you are as much as we can in the course of 5 or 6 years and make sure that you know what you have to put in a research statement that describes your research program.
I'll add on like I come from a bigger family and learned a very long time ago that fair does not mean equal. And that's something I say to all of my students. And again, that transparency is so key because there's opportunities that I will give to some and not others, right? To like help me review manuscript articles and, you know, those kind of things. But, you know, again, that transparency is key of like why I'm doing certain things. But then I also, again, that communication and that transparency of having conversations about their goals, trying to find opportunities. I think what to me one of the biggest things that I struggle with and kind of am working through of like those that aren't sure, because academia is what I know. And so if they're not sure about academia or like industry of like creating opportunities and those kind of things, for them to have some exposure, you know, to different things. So, you know, creating those opportunities. But I think sometimes if, you know, if you just look on paper, it might be that some people are getting more mentorship or less mentorship. They're just getting different mentorship. So that's something that I take a lot of pride and effort in is tailoring mentorship, but it is exhausting. Like I will say, you know, it's easier said than done. But I think that's the key. So if in the perfect world, everybody gets exactly what they need, you know, more of an equity versus equality. But again, it can be challenging. And there are some weeks where they're all getting the same thing and it's probably not that great. But that's kind of where we're at. But, you know, again, creating that space for like, I'm really flexible with them. So when I ask for that flexibility, I'm more likely to kind of get that in return. But that tailoring again, but you have to know the students very well. And so, you know, that comes with time and communication and those kind of things.
I think the other professors are really great mentors. I'm not sure if I could do that when I'm also a professor. I'll just add that I liked how my professors gave like students with like the newcomer students, like second first and second year PhD students to work on their own as a team. Like they paired 2 or 3 newcomers as a team and let them experience the research process by their own from the beginning to the end. Like and I think they learned a lot of um, important things along the way. So I think it's also important to make diverse combinations of students to work with different people in different research projects.
So what it sounds like is a lot of our mentorship and support for students at different stages comes back to our idea of collaboration and how important it is for our units to collaborate with each other and for each other. And I kind of wanted to build off of what Nikki had brought up, this idea of like equal and fairness. And it kind of made me think of our next question in regards to conflict that might arise from students maybe not understanding that concept. So how do you handle conflicts in the lab, and what processes or structures like help prevent or address them?
I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about, whether it's intentionally to prevent or it does, but I mean, I think a lot of the things we've already talked about is that kind of preventative measures. But with that, I mean, there's always things that happen. So for me, and I think Dion, this is kind of what you were saying about like when you choose who you want to work in your labs. I know every university is kind of different, but when I interview undergrads who want to do that, like I always kind of sit down and I think about the culture that I try to support in my lab. And, if there's certain questions I'll ask and things like that to avoid bringing in someone who's like really competitive or those kind of things. So, like Deanna, I do a lot of work in schools. And so I will bring on students who don't have any publications because I know I didn't. But that teaching, I don't want to, I can spend time doing this. So I prioritize the things that are important to me. And then the kind of, the interviews and the personalities and those kind of things that align with my goals and our lab goals. So I think part of that preventative thing is, creating a space or bringing in the people that that have the same ideas and the same, mission and those kind of things. Because I will say that is something that, they don't really talk to you about is, I went through several advisors of, just for fit and leaving and all this kind of stuff. But, when you choose a student, like, it's like, oh, we no longer, their paths diverge, those kind of things. They're not usually just like kicked out of the program. And I know it's different, but like this is a commitment on their part and a commitment on your part. So fit is so important. And I think, from a preventative standpoint, one way to prevent these conflicts is to make sure that there's that, create an environment that shouldn't have a lot of conflicts. I'll talk about the reactive because that's the harder one. I'll let other people talk first.
One thing that's really important to know is that you can't deal with conflict if you don't know it's there. And young people are often very reluctant to go to the PI and say, we've been having this disagreement, or I don't know how to deal with this RA or something, because they think it reflects badly on them. They don't want to bother. They think the person's busy or whatever. So I think one thing that's really important is to think about creating a lab culture where people feel comfortable coming to you with their conflicts, because if you don't know about them, you can't do anything about them. And if they fester, then things can get out of hand and so on. So, I personally try to be as grateful when people come to me and say, hey, like I'm arguing with this person or we can't agree on this or whatever. And I'm like, thank you for telling me. Now let's have a conversation. Like, this is really great. The same thing applies with not just interpersonal conflict, but when things go wrong, like somebody makes a mistake And they really hate to tell you because it makes them look bad. But, like at the same time, if they don't tell you, then, like it can remain there and impair lab functioning for a long time. So just make sure that when whatever, in as many ways as you can, signal that you're very open and grateful if people come to you when things go wrong. Right. And smile and say, I'm so happy you told me this. Now we can do something about it. So I think and that's also something that's kind of like hard to realize from, like not having been on this side, that people are reluctant to tell you things. So the other small kind of like tip and trick I would encourage to kind of like a structural solution to avoiding conflict. No matter how much you want to select people who will get along, you will invariably fail at some point. And even people who get along famously can get into conflicts under certain circumstances. And what I've learned the hard way is that those circumstances are often, well, at least one circumstance is when there's constant, incessant having to share resources. So, for example, when I started my lab, I thought it was a great idea to have a shared pool of research assistants that all the graduate students can work with, you know? And it turns out that that's a lot of like coordination and sharing and so on. And some research assistants are better than others, and the graduate students know who they are. So that they kind of ended up being all this kind of like conflict and so on. Maybe it was about other things as well, but I think this was at least one of the things that was happening because like the RAs only have so many hours in the lab, and like if they work 75% of the hours with this graduate student, then the other graduate student who wants to work with them won't be able to. So my solution is, as much as possible, foster autonomy, which we know is a good motivational tool as well, by allowing your graduate students to kind of like, as much as possible, run their mini labs within your lab, like recruit their own research assistants, set, a schedule for meeting with the research assistants, figure out how to train the research assistants, and so on and so forth. And of course, you kind of have to kind of like hover in the background and make sure that they know what they're doing and so on. But to the extent that each of them can kind of like run their research, of course, to the extent that your research is the kind of research that's amenable to this sort of thing. If your research is the kind of stuff that involves everyone going into school and doing the same thing, then forget what I said. Like it's not applicable. But for many labs, what I said is a feasible solution. And I think one thing that I've noticed, of course, I don't have the counterfactual, so who knows, maybe this is just like completely untrue, is that there's a lot less friction and a lot less conflict in the lab because I minimize the opportunities for the friction to arise by minimizing the amount of coordination that needs to happen over shared resources.
I'll just add on to that real quick too of I think creating that safe space for them to come to you. I think there also can be conflicts like student supervisor conflicts. And so, that's a little bit more challenging. But one of the things I've done with some success, I mean, it's always hard to hear, is having an anonymous feedback form that my students can fill out at any point for class or for the lab that just kind of like gives me feedback and I think the one that I'm remembering is like the way I was running the lab or the project team meetings, that I was talking too much, which will come as a shock to none of you by now. And they wanted to be more involved. And that's something I really kind of struggled with, like hearing the feedback. It's always like, but then also what to do next, right? So the next few meetings I fumbled my way through, but I think we eventually got to a good place. And they did improve for the better. It's almost like they were right and I was wrong. But creating that space, I was so happy that they're like, we need this, and they're asking for it. And that really helped. Again, I'm not saying I took it very well, but it also created a space where I could do that and deal with that privately. They felt more comfortable, and I still have no idea who wrote it, and I don't need to. So I think that's one of the littlest tiny things that was easy to do, and also provides opportunities for autonomy and that your voice being heard and those kind of things.
All the good things that they said. I'm not going to repeat it. But I think Nikki, you said this earlier, but I do find that transparency, like a little bit more than transparency. It's one really trying to be intentional about what is about looking and seeking
Mhm.
information about what's going on, right? So I think oftentimes you get a little subtle clue there's a conflict, right? Someone's not talking who usually talks in the meeting. Someone's not around. You haven't seen them come to the lab for a couple of days. Like there's usually a sign that something is up. It might not be something that has to do with anybody in the lab, but something is going on with the person. And I usually try not to listen to the voice in my head. Well, maybe it's not in my head, wherever it's coming from, and say, reach out and see what's going on. Um, and usually I'm right. Something is going on. It may not have anything to do with what's going on in the lab, but it's a course or a family member, something's going on with them. And then you decide how you want to navigate that thing because it may not even be related to you or whatever. Maybe it's just, okay, now that I know what's going on, I guess it's something you have to deal with. Let me know if I can help. And then you move on. Um, Also being very explicit about particular things. You won't be mean, you won't belittle anyone. I won't tolerate these things. Like just be clear about what are the social norms around engaging. We don't talk over people. We don't mansplain. We don't take over and talk for students who are international students. We respect everyone who's here and everyone's ideas. But I also encourage argument and I encourage disagreement around ideas. And we talk about the ways that we practice the ways that we do that in a way that's respectful and that we all learn from it. Because that in the past, when there's been tension, it's been that someone said something, shared an idea, someone disagreed, and then the other person was just like, why do they think they're so smart? Or, why did they make me feel like I was stupid? And I was like, they didn't make you feel like that was all up in your head. But yeah, so like also recognizing who's a little bit more sensitive, like who needs a little bit of support in managing and navigating critical feedback and helping to manage that in meetings and helping to work with them outside of meetings to help them to navigate that space. And I think remember Nikki said it's a lot, it's a lot. Um, Trying to keep tabs on all of that sometimes. I mean, I've gotten better at it over time. And I'm kind of, I think, more inclined to detect, variations in um emotional kind of needs. And kind of try to attend to those before they erupt into something that is more destructive than I can manage or help or support. And then, as I said, be really explicit about what is appropriate. I think even talking to them about particular things that's going on. If I have a conflict, I talk about the details of the conflict without naming any names. Sometimes when I have pushback around something that is a faculty thing, I'll say, when you get to your place, sometimes there are policies that come up and those policies don't serve students. And this is how I'm navigating this particular thing. I was in a particular meeting. I mentioned something. Somebody didn't like what I said. This was how they responded. This was how I responded. To I'll give them also examples of how you engage with things that pop up. Um, but you also have to be mindful, no names, like be as PC as you can in those things. And I've learned to be more explicit about that because where else are they going to know how to do these things besides having those conversations with you? I talk to them about like how is it to isolate or separate their personal identity from their academic identity. I talk to them about how to receive feedback as it's a suggestion. You put your like and what agreement they are making with journal when they produce their work. I agree to submit my work. I also agree to receive feedback. It's an agreement. So like that's what you're doing. I in the meeting, you make an agreement. I'm going to share my idea. I'm open to receiving feedback. that's you didn't say it explicitly, but that's really what you're agreeing to. And you're looking at it as someone is making a suggestion about maybe something that you could change or modify, or they're giving you an idea that maybe you didn't think about before about your ideas. So like there are ways that you want to interpret it, and it's not, no, people don't know you. It's not a personal statement that you are incompetent. That is not the way that it is intended to be received. So those explicit conversations around how to take up ideas that may be different from your own or may conflict or contrast, I think is also helpful in terms of like, how is it that you're processing those things and how is it that you navigate those things in a very direct way?
I'll just add real quick that Samantha said this at the beginning, but I highly doubt most of you caught it. I study collaborative regulation of emotions and socio-emotional interactions and those kind of things. So this is like part of my job is to like watch videos and code people doing these things. So it's easier for me, and it's going to be easier for some. So like I think that's what's kind of hard, is picking up on these things are not always easy. Dion, I can tell like you're very intuitive, and yeah, like you talked about coding, so you're a qualitative person, like you're used to kind of watching human. For some people it's going to come a little bit more naturally, but for others it's going to be hard to kind of notice these things happening, and so that's something that you can either come and join this social regulation of learning people, just change your whole discipline, or no, and really kind of reflect that about yourself. I have plenty of weaknesses, I have plenty of strengths. Picking up on these kind of things and subtleties is something I am strong at. I am much worse at other things. But I think knowing that about yourself, and if you aren't good at like picking up those things, coming up with a plan for how do I get that information in a way that kind of makes sense. But I have noticed that like when I'll talk to somebody and they're like, "Oh, I didn't notice," and I'm like, like, really? Oh, well, yeah. Maybe it's in my head. Maybe I'm just bad at it, but. And sorry, Dion, I didn't mean to talk for you. I was guessing. Maybe I'm wrong. You can correct me if I'm good at picking up on people.
I've learned to be that.
Yeah.
I got better over time. And I think also
So you can tell me how good I am at, yeah.
I think one thing that I want to say before is also culture. When you have people in your lab who are from different spaces, American versus Asian versus people from Africa, the continent, people from the Caribbean, that dynamic is also something you want to be attuned to, because cultural practices they show up and sometimes they're interpreted differently. And what I have my students who come from Korea and China have told me is that culturally we don't talk over people. We wait until there is silence and a pause and an entry point for them to share ideas. And so if you're not aware of that as running the lab or the person who you've put in charge of the lab, you'll find that there isn't opportunity for everybody to participate in a really meaningful way, and you have to create space. You have to create space for that. So also like that's important to also pay attention to.
And similarly, I think all of the students right now that are in my lab are from Asia, and there's again cultural differences in giving feedback, and again the power dynamics and critiquing other people's work and things like that. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I think creating a space that we're here to learn from each other does, I think, add and help to that. We're all kind of differences, let's value different opinions and those kind of things. Because if you say you're going to value opinions but you don't take some time to learn about their culture and where they come from and how that impacts what they do, again, it's kind of seeing that through.
I also waited for the silence for me to speak. I think my professors are also adopting the strategies that three of the professors talked about, and I find it really helpful. And one of the other things that they strategically do would be having a lab captain. or a student representative, which is what I am now, they have this insider like point of view for them. Um, so there is also this lab captain and always this lab captain in the lab who is a student, who could be a representative voice for the students. And the professors wants the lab captain to be a bridge between the professors and the students so that they could pick on the conflicts that they would not be aware of if there's no lab captain. So I think that could be one of the strategies for the professors or the mentors to like have this role for students um, to manage the conflicts that could happen between the students or between the students and mentors.
An interesting point that I think came up across everybody is the way that conflict like implicitly affects people. So you make just the tone of your voice or the way that you leave comments can create conflicts in this lab. Like I'm really direct when I give feedback. That's always my feedback when I'm TA in a course is that I'm too direct and it feels mean. But I'm just like, I'm just getting to the point. So something I've started doing is when people ask for feedback, being like, do you want critical feedback or do you want blind support? You need to let me know which one. So we stay on the same page. So I think that's an interesting concept that came up across everybody. We are going to jump to our last question because we're running low on time. And I want to give an opportunity to ask some of the questions that came up in the chat. So our final question is looking back, what do you wish someone had told you about creating or running a lab when you first started?
I think it connects with exactly what you said, that not everybody receives critical feedback in the same way. Because I'm more or less like, I already know that something's good about it. Don't point that out. Like, tell me what's wrong with it so I can fix it. And I get really impatient when they do the sandwich thing where they start with, well, this is timely and relevant work, and
Me as well.
these research questions are really on point, and I'm really impatient. And there was an assumption, like, yeah, everybody just wants you to get to the point so that they can go about their business and you can go about theirs, and that's not correct at all. So I wish that was more clear. It would have saved me a lot of tears of others.
I don't know if, yeah, I don't know if this is how good an answer this is, but I guess I wish I had understood better or I'd been told better how the job of being a PI is different from the job of being a graduate student in all the different ways, so that I didn't have to kind of like worry that I'm doing something wrong when my days looked very different from my days as a graduate student. So, like as a PI, more and more how you do research is by having meetings and answering emails, whereas as a graduate student, like if you were just doing that, you weren't making progress, right? So, for example, or, the fact that you're a manager, essentially a fundraiser, uh, emotional support coach, and all those things wrapped into one. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I wish there was a course out there about like main differences between being a graduate student or a postdoc and a PI, and what not to worry about and what to look out for.
I think my advice would be to come to more sessions like this, right, Samantha? But really to kind of think about, because again, we have different experiences, and again, I think the reflection piece is key as you're going through these, making a note of like the things that you liked and the things that you didn't like, the things that you want to do the same and you want to do differently. And I think, starting early, it took me 4 years to come up with my lab name. and somebody else did it for me. I know someone who used generative AI recently, but I think it's a process. I think you can start thinking about your research lab now. I think it's a reflection of who you are and your values, and I think that's something that I think it'll help with the job market. I think it'll help with your research and the things that you do, is to really reflect on who you are, where you want to be, what kind of community do you want to create. And I don't think that you can really wait to do that. So that, like, to Andre's point, when you go to those seminars and they're like, this is how it's different, you already kind of have that foundation in your head of like what's important to you. You just need to learn how to apply it in those situations. But I think, if you've only been in one academic lab, you only have that experience, and you might think like this is the way that it's supposed to be done. So also I recommend that students like go into other labs, reach out to other people on campus or in the department, attend other lab meetings, attend workshops and those kind of things, and really think about and reflect what's important to them. And again, maybe don't tell them to their face, like I would never do it that way. Or maybe they want the advice or the feedback, but I think that reflection piece is key and a big part of knowing who you are, and again, this can start immediately.
Although I'm not running my lab at the moment, but if I want to keep some things from the lab that I'm in right now, that I would really try hard to create a very learning and growth oriented culture that everyone would value, like learning from each other, just as how the other professors have talked about.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing that. We've got one question in the chat from Natalie, who had to leave, but she said that she will come back and look at this in the recording. She wants to know, how do you handle authorship conversations, especially for people at different levels for their career?
So one thing is you want to have really open conversations about authorship. So that's the first thing with anybody, even if it's not grad students, but other faculty, PIs, writing a grant, all of those things. I think try to get a sense of what everyone thinks about that way ahead of time. I just rolled off of a grant, and one of the early conversations was like, how are we going to go about writing? Or if you have an idea about data that we collected that's different from the main questions, how do you do that? And everybody agreed you would write up a little paragraph describing what you want to do, what data you want to use, and you would send it to everyone on the team. And whoever wants to be a part of it, then they would contact you, and then you would decide on a plan of work and authorship moving on from there. But typically, if it's your idea, you get dibs on first authorship, right? In my space, most, if not all of the research ideas are generated by me. So I'm definitely going to be an author. But sometimes, even though I should be first author, I just, another student who I know is going out is really, really interested in this idea, and I shift the authorship, and I'll be second and they'll be first. And sometimes, again, it generates from my data, but I really am not interested. But I know I'm going to have to work on it anyway because they need the support. And so I'm just like, I'm fine with being last. So I think you negotiate those things, but we still have a conversation. Okay, Nikki's really interested. Andre's like kind of sort of interested. Do you want to be third or fourth? And Nikki's going to lead. These are the usher positions they want to take. Where else does everyone want to fit in into this? Or do you not want to be on this? They rarely ever get the option to not be on it, but that's on a different conversation. So explicit, determine in terms of interest and where they are. For example, new grad students don't get options of what projects they work on. They have to work on everything I tell them to work on in the first year because they don't know it yet, but they need the publication and they need the presentations. And I determine if you're just starting on your learning, it's unlikely you're going to be higher authorship. And I explain what that means. You might think you're doing a lot of work and you're just fifth author, but you're learning. And that's kind of how it is. And I don't make it hidden, like it's out there. And so is second author now, but she's in her fourth year. And she also started with fifth authorship initially. I think that's where sometimes, like Andrea was saying, that you kind of anticipate where conflict might happen and you just be really overt in terms of what these guidelines are. And then it kind of tends to not erupt. You might disagree with it, but this is how it's going to be. And then you realize, wow, this is a great plan in your third year when you're like way up there with authorship. If it's an idea that's completely the student's idea, but they want the lab to kind of help to support, to build it out, to work on it, then most of the time they're the first author and I'm somewhere in the second or third if there's another grad student, and then we kind of work on it in that way. So it's some version of that tends to happen. But one thing is constant is that we talk about that right up front. And then she had another question, and I'll just comment on that. I don't ever cut our students off. So most of my students have their own line of work. It just resembles things that I do. And so I don't have to worry about, like, are they going to be able to make an argument that they have their own line of research? Yes, they can make that argument. And so for as long as they are interested in working with me, that's fine with me. They go off, postdocs, faculty, they find other people to work with, but then there's always seems to be something that we still have in common. And so we still tend to, kind of have work going on at some point, but they do other things too.
I'll just add two quick things to that. One is exactly that. I have a form that shouldn't surprise you. I have a form that they fill out, and it also scaffolds them through and asks them specific questions. And this is an idea I got from a PI in grad school of, like, they have to propose a project. But also, like, the roles of what does first author mean first, in setting those expectations very clearly, because as papers can go on for a long time, and people get busy and their availability changes with comps, especially a revise and resubmit, but setting those clear expectations, because I have run into some issues. Sometimes you learn from your mistakes, but the other thing is I use APA has, like, clear what deserves authorship and what doesn't guidelines that I use. As I really struggled a bit on the job market when I first came out, because I didn't have a ton of publications, but I was very involved in all of them, which took a lot of time. But then I was going up on the job market against people who had, tons, and you look at their labs and it seems like some people are just like, I make the joke of breathed in the vicinity of the research and they got added to so to me, it's one of those, setting your own guidelines or using APA guidelines or whatever the guidelines are. I think it's important to set those clear expectations, but also once you're in the project, and this is something that I'm not always good at, and I always regret when I don't use it, of, like, who's responsible for what. And again, a fourth author on one is not going to be the same as fourth author on another, but having that conversation and that negotiation, I think, is really important. I will say just one little thing that I really struggle with. I actually have an issue with a lot of my students doing own independent work. And so, like, whether it's a systematic review or even empirical research at another site, like, sometimes I struggle to kind of get my students to slow down a bit. And so I even have to make sure they fill out a form to let me know what they're doing elsewhere. They don't have, if it's not my research, they don't have to put me on it. But they ask. And again, I'm like, if you want my expertise and I can contribute in a way, but I don't want to create a norm of, like, I'm in charge of you, so you have to, put me on this. But that's something I've really kind of been struggling with a bunch.
Can I just say one little thing to add to Nikki's point? And then I think one of the things that, and I'll go back, it's two questions in one, that I wish someone had told me is how different the culture of authorship is at different institutions. So the culture of authorship at my original institution was if a student came to you with an idea and you were going to help them to work on the idea, you don't become an author. You just kind of mentor them through the process and they use all of your brain and all of your work, all of your power, and it would be just Nikki's sole authorship. And so I spent a good many years of my early career because that wasn't the culture. I came from an institution where faculty did not put their names on students' dissertations. They just did not. I went to an institution where faculty did not put their name on students' dissertations. They just did not. Then I came to an institution where their names were on all 3 articles that came out of a dissertation. And that creates an unevenness in the community and a disadvantage to you that, well, I mean, after 12 years, I couldn't catch up anymore, but I have changed the way what I just said to you now is that shift in the last 5 years. I didn't know that people did that. I just did not. And I had been out in the field for many, many years. I just never asked and people never shared because you tend to assume what you come to know and what you do is what everybody does. So if I leave one thing with you, as you go to different places, if it's grad student to grad student from a different institution, ask them how things work there. When you meet with faculty members, just ask them about things like tenure, publication, publishing. The more ideas you have about how things occur, the better off you'll be. It doesn't mean you're going to adopt that way. It just means you have a broader repertoire of information from which to draw. And so you are not disadvantaged. So with that few rest.
I will be remiss if I didn't say I am so sorry that that happened to you and they normalized that. I will say one of the most important things that happened to me with one of Dion's current colleagues is my advisor allowed me, we had a conversation about one of my 3 articles where I did write, it was from my comps, which they wouldn't allow me to get any help with. And we had a conversation of like, to let me be a solo author. And that's something that we negotiated. And that's something that was really important for me. And we negotiated that and we left. And I think he felt great about it. And I felt great about it. And that's the same conversation, you know, if it's especially with dissertations, you know, I think about like when I give reviewers feedback on like you know, I usually am a reviewer too, unfortunately. You know, that I don't ask for authorship there, right? So different universities, I know I was at UNC, like you couldn't necessarily co-author part of the dissertation, but ours you can. And there's sections in there. So again, learning the culture and that, but I think Dion hit it perfectly of like, there's the school culture, there's your lab culture, but there's the community, the field culture that I think is really important, that remembering that of, you know, if you want your student to be competitive and successful in the broader field, not just in your lab, in your school, etc.
They can now, Nikki.
What?
Faculty can be on dissertation articles.
Like
submitted.
I was also one of the first to do the 3 article. I'll just say, I'm not, you know, I fumbled my way through that. Good to know that they're finally okay. Anyway, we'll say.
I just wanted to add that I really like how my professors or supervisors decide very explicitly on the authorship before the project begins, so that the students could expect like the extent to which they should contribute to the projects during the project.
And also to address a part of Natalie's question that we haven't gotten to, she asked about undergrad RAs versus grad students and postdocs. I think the reason why, I mean, it's more typical for graduate students and postdocs to have authorship than for undergrad RAs to have authorship is not the career stage, but rather the type of contribution, which is one of the hypotheses that Natalie had, right? Like I think generally, and the APA guidelines reflect this, conceptual contributions are more likely to get you authorship than simply being trained to run the study and going out to a park or to a school and running the study. And that's a more typical task for an undergraduate RA. But to the extent that the undergraduate RA makes conceptual contributions of various sorts, then they should be allowed to have authorship as well.
Thank you so much for all of your feedback. And as we close, I just want to thank our panelists for their insightful and enriching conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. I hope to see you all next month for our October Motivation Monday, which is October 27th from 7 to 8:30 Eastern Time. And that topic is going to be on teaching educational psychology and bridging theory and practice. So thank you all again. I really appreciate it.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you
you
all.
all. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.